Good afternoon. I know the amazing stories of 90 women whose names you've never heard. And I know these stories because for the past 8 years, I have told these stories on my monthly blog called Strong Women in History, followed now in over 64 countries. Today, we're going to explore what are the 3 common elements that all strong women possess. But how did I discover my first strong woman? I found her in a graveyard. I was doing family genealogy, and I wanted to put flowers on my great-grandfather's grave. I had grown up hearing my mother's stories of how my great-grandfather, James Nolan, had become very wealthy during the Civil War because he had produced a unique cloth for soldiers' uniforms. And his wife had been the inspiration for making that cloth. And then my mother would always say, and we're very proud because none of it was shoddy. I want you to come back with me in history and let me explain. The term shoddy comes from Great Britain during their Industrial Revolution, 1825. There were several unscrupulous manufacturers who took pieces of processed wool that were moth-eaten or had holes in them, and they cut out all the good parts. And they glued those good parts together and then put it under very heavy industrial irons. And when the cloth came out, the glue had melted all the parts together and the fabric looked like it was brand new. You can stretch shoddy, you can cut shoddy, you can sew shoddy. What you can't do is let it get wet. This is 1861 now, and the Philadelphia manufacturers are in a frenzy. They all want the government contracts for the Civil War, and so they sell the unsuspecting federal government bolts of shoddy, and nobody realizes it's happening. Let's jump to July of 1861. Right down the road in Manassas is the first major battle of the Civil War. Now, during the first year of the Civil War, every battle had 2 names. The Northerners called it by what was the closest body of water. The Southerners called it by what was the closest town. So at the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, the North assumed they were going to win, but they did not. When the Yankee soldiers had to walk back 16 miles to Washington, D.C., a horrific rainstorm occurred. And it rained nonstop for 6 hours. And with the rain, the glue in shoddy dissolved. There were pant legs that fell out, there were sleeves that fell off, and all the way back during those 16 miles, the road was littered with uniforms that had been done with shoddy, but not my great-grandfather's cloth. In 1998, I arrived at New Cathedral Cemetery in Philadelphia, and I found our family's small mausoleum. The caretaker handed me a list of who was buried in each crypt. And I saw my great-grandfather's name, James Nolan, at the top. On his left was my great-grandmother, Sarah Jane Brady. And on the right was a woman whose name was Mrs. James Nolan. And I asked the caretaker who she was, but he had no idea. The other crypts were all ancestors whose names I understood, and at the very bottom there were 3 very small crypts for children. I left the cemetery that day really bothered that a woman could be buried without her own name. And jokingly, but not so funny, I turned to my husband and said, "Look, if I go first, don't you dare put just your name on my tombstone." Within a week, I started really wanting to know more about this mystery woman. So I started trying to find out who she might be. It took me months, but I found out that her name was Ellen Canavan, and she had been my great-grandfather's first wife. No one in our family had ever even heard of her. Months turned into years of researching her, and I finally pieced together her story. She was a young Irish immigrant. No money, no family connections, and no education. But she had a passion. She wanted to become a businesswoman in the cutthroat textile industry of 1861 Philadelphia. She was proactive. She studied textile manufacturing at the Mercantile Library Archives on her own, and she persevered, even in the face of life-threatening obstacles. She eventually convinced my great-grandfather to sponsor her in business, and they traveled to Savannah to purchase premier cotton for this unique cloth they were going to make. But while they're in Savannah, Fort Sumter gets fired upon, and the Civil War explodes around them. I admired her bravery and determination so much that I eventually wrote my first novel, Cut from Strong Cloth, to tell her remarkable story. And then I realized there had to be other women just like Ellen who did amazing things with their lives but never got the accolades they deserved. So I started my blog. In the 8 years that I have been blogging about strong women, I have found that they all share these three common elements. 1, they have a passion. 2, they are proactive. And 3, they persevere. And like Ellen Canavan, the women of my blog disappeared from history without the accolades they deserved. And so I started searching them out, and I found Annie Charbonneau, a young woman who rallied the miners' wives to face a vigilante mob in Western Maryland during the violent 1894 coal strike. So I told her story in my second novel, Last Curtain Call. Maggie Canavan is my newest strong woman, and I wrote her legacy in my latest book, Counting Crows, which just came out last month, and I'm proud to say it debuted on Amazon within the top 100 books of historical fiction. It was the infamous Triangle factory fire in 1911 in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, that prompted Maggie to become proactive. The Triangle sweatshop factory employed all immigrant girls. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, for a weekly salary of $4. Take a look around you in this room. This room where we are seated is approximately the same size as the Triangle workroom on the 8th floor of the factory. Instead of our nice round luncheon tables, imagine that there are row upon row of wooden tables, and instead of 100 people in this room, there are 180 workers. They are crammed side by side at the long wooden tables, and they are working on pinning patterns, cutting fabric, or operating sewing machines. And under each table, there are large bins of highly flammable cotton fabric. And overhead, crisscrossing the ceiling, hang tissue paper patterns like prom decorations from wall to wall. At 4:50 p.m. on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, the closing bell rings. And in the next moment, no one knows who for sure, but someone flipped the stub of a glowing cigarette to the floor. But it fell into a scrap bin instead. Within moments, the scraps ignited. Then the flames climbed up to the wooden tables and the bolts of fabric. And next, the fire leaps to the ceiling and starts consuming the tissue paper patterns. The blaze zigzags across the entire room. Within 10 minutes, the entire room is engulfed in an inferno. The back door back there has been locked, so the girls don't get to sneak out and have an extra bathroom break. There's only one other door, and it has been narrowed so that only one person at a time can exit. 180 people, one exit. Panic sets in. Women begin to claw their way over each other in a desperate attempt to escape. And inside of just 20 minutes, 146 of those immigrant girls die. 84 burn to death, and 62 leap out of the 8th floor windows to the concrete sidewalk below. The owners of the Triangle factory were charged with negligence, but were never convicted. Maggie arrives in Greenwich Village in 1918, and she wants to right the wrongs of the sweatshop industry. And she becomes swept up in the new feminist movement. And all goes very well until the 1918 flu pandemic slams New York City, and in a few months, 33,000 die of the flu, and it alters Maggie's destiny. Determined to succeed, she begins to rebuild her life. Passion, proactive, persevere. These are the threads of all strong women. There are strong women all around us, and each one deserves to have their story told. So whatever it is with your life, think of your passion, be proactive, no one's going to hand it to you, and persevere no matter how difficult the objects are. Thank you.